Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomi Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomi. What is Atomi? It's an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific video and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. Our goal is to help make life easier for our teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you want to find out more about Atomi, head over to our main site at getatomi.com and feel free to try it out for free. Today's episode is a special edition and comes as our response to the global pandemic caused by coronavirus. Several schools have had full or partial closures due to coronavirus scares, and we'd like to help where we can. If your school has to take drastic action, we're extending complimentary access to our platform. This will provide teachers with an online library of curriculum-specific Stage 6 content and assessments to minimize any disruption to student learning. If you'd like to explore this, don't hesitate to email us at schools@getatomi.com. In the meantime, we've put together this special edition episode on using asynchronous learning during the lockdown. With the help of our resident teaching expert Sue, we explored different methods and resources for employing asynchronous learning and how to incorporate both asynchronous and synchronous elements into online teaching. If that sounds good to you, make sure to subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your platform of choice is, and we'll never say no to a quick 5-star review. For now, have a listen and enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hello and welcome to another special edition coronavirus episode of Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon, and I'm joined today by our resident teaching expert, former head of English, digital learning leader for curriculum and pedagogy, and director of curriculum, Sue. Hello, Sue.
Hi, Simon. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Still adapting to the home setup. We were just discussing the differences between how far along we are in Ireland versus in Australia, but it's all pretty strange no matter where you are, I guess.
Yeah, I think adapting is the way that everybody's going at the moment. Yeah, everything's different.
Everything is different. It's a process. We'll be institutionalized by the end of the month. We won't want to go back to the old ways. Is my not quite positive take, but I guess a hot take.
I think in Australia, because, obviously we're going into autumn and winter, you can see like a bit more cozy on the couch kind of evenings. We just changed the clocks. So that's, you feel like, the nights are drawing in a little bit. But yeah, if in Ireland and the UK approaching summer, I'm sure you just are more wanting to get out rather than stay.
Yeah, I was going to say it's the exact opposite. We've actually had blazing sunshine here in Dublin for the last week, which has been, looked so nice. And I guess, for the, 10 minutes when we're allowed to run around, avoiding everybody outside, it's nice. But that's only going to get worse and worse. But anyway, we're not here to bemoan all of the issues with self-isolation. We are here to hopefully provide a little bit of help to teachers out there who are adjusting to the new strictures and systems around having to bring a lot of their learning online. We obviously had our first episode on how to deal with the new situation a couple of weeks ago. Now we are going to get a little more specific with what teachers can do by focusing on asynchronous learning. So right off the bat, I am going to put you in the hot seat and ask you to explain to the listeners what exactly asynchronous learning is.
Sure. Well, it's quite different to synchronous learning that we would normally do in the classroom. So it is where you take most of the learning activities and you're doing them on your own. So I saw a nice phrase the other day that you're learning together, just not all at the same time. So a synchronous model is where you've got students together in a classroom. You might have some homework, but mainly the teaching is in class. And if you think of that at like one end of the scale, the teachers there, they might not obviously all be learning at exactly the same time, but the learning is being delivered at the same time. And then along the scale, you've got sort of blended learning, flipped learning, and then at the furthest end of the scale would be this asynchronous learning. And really what you're looking at there is, students are given work to do, maybe videos of the teachers teaching or materials presented to them. But the kids mainly are able to complete the work when it suits them, so much more of a do it on your own schedule, your own time.
Yeah, I was going to say, just listening to you explain it there, it did definitely call to mind a few of the things that we've already discussed before, just as general ideas, blended learning, flipped learning. But as you're saying, it's kind of the extreme end of that scale, is it? It's taking those ideas and bringing them almost to the nth degree.
Yeah, and you can certainly still do it in a face-to-face model if you were sort of, really collapsing the traditional structure of a classroom and putting, more of your learning online and students doing, say, a mastery path through the learning, so they're sort of working through the material and doing it as it suits their level of understanding, and the teacher sort of chipping and chiming in face-to-face when it suits. But what we're looking at here, obviously, in response to the coronavirus, is that teachers are not having that face-to-face connection, or they might be having it in synchronous sessions, but mainly the learning is asynchronous, and they're sort of working mostly by themselves with very limited individual supervision.
Yeah, so it's easy to see where it comes in. Yeah, in the current situation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, because obviously that's the key element in sparking this discussion. But firstly, I'm going to briefly ask you to put on your scientist, theoretical individual hat, call it what you will, and explain to us a little bit about how asynchronous learning has its roots in constructivist theory. It's not the first time I've thrown that phrase at you on this podcast, but here it comes again.
This is where I think of all the teachers just sort of graduating, and they've got all of these different theories very prominent in their mind.
Exactly. This is for them. This is to make sure they don't lose it, to keep it refreshed at the front of the mind.
Sure. Well, constructivist theory views learning very much as an active thing. Obviously, it says in the title, a constructive activity. So looking at an asynchronous approach in this theory, I think it's more evoked because it's an acknowledgement of learners having sort of prior skills, having preferences and learning styles, even being able to construct or build their own schedule around when learning suits them best. And so I think that idea of the active learner being at the forefront of this is where the constructivist theory really shines through.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All of the young teachers will be thanking you for keeping that. Even the older teachers who may have forgotten about it long ago will be thanking you for sparking back up constructivism. To bring us back away from the theory side of things and onto, again, what, as I say, sparked the issue of what we're dealing with at the moment, what teachers are dealing with at the moment. I wanted to kind of dive a little deeper with you into the increased importance of asynchronous learning in the current climate. Obviously, teachers are being forced now to bring their learning online. The face-to-face classroom interaction is off the table. So specifically, what does asynchronous learning bring? How does it help teachers and students operating under the new strictures?
Sure. Well, I don't know how things are going over in Ireland, but just to sort of contextualise it over here, it seems that there's been really two models adapted by schools at the moment in response to the current situation. And one is a very synchronous model where the students and teachers are still following what's a very typical timetable, even down to, like, I've seen some schools, you know, they take roll call at sort of, you know, the normal school day, maybe like 8:30 in the morning. Kids are dressed in school uniform, and a lot of the sessions are like delivered in a webinar format through Zoom or some other platform, and they're very much sort of forward-facing, teacher to student-facing in a synchronous design for however long that classroom period would have been. Kids are told to mainly stick to the normal breaks of the school day and the lunch times, that sort of thing. And it's very much like the computer has been the substitute for the face-to-face interaction. So that's one model that a lot of schools have looked at. And then the other model is the asynchronous model, where maybe at the beginning of the week, teachers are releasing the work for that week, and either like a matrix that goes with it of the activities that kids need to do during the week. Maybe some sessions where the teachers will be available for synchronous sessions, but mainly the work is set and kids are sort of navigating through it when it suits them, which could be, you know, like 5 in the evening, or it could be their normal school day, depending on you know, their situation. And
I certainly know my timetable has been definitely affected by everything that's going on. It's almost impossible for it not to be. So yeah, just hearing that, it makes perfect sense.
Well, yeah, and I think with asynchronous, there's quite a few reasons for it being a model that's quite a good one, in terms of, you know, if you've got students at home and you've got parents working at home, if you've got, you know, you've only got a certain bandwidth with your internet, and say you've got parents who are having themselves synchronous sessions with their work, you know, they've got to Zoom in for meetings, they might even be conducting, you know, training, like I'm doing sort of Zoom training during the day, and you might have kids with only one device. You know, if you've got 3 kids at home and one device, it's kind of impossible to do a synchronous learning for all of them if you've not got that sort of access to the internet as well. So I think the asynchronous model is increasingly becoming popular because, you know, the demands on the parents to sort of hold a normal school day, the demands on the technology and all of that sort of stuff is also proving quite difficult. And then, as you say, you know, we're all adapting to a very difficult situation. And I think within that as we adapt to that, things do change, you know. So I know, like, my kid's 6, he's being set work from his school. They use a platform called Seesaw, which is a really awesome little communication and two-way communication tool. But because of my work schedule, we often start his work about 3:30, 4 o'clock, which is the end of the school day. And it's the next day when his teacher checks the work. But that's how it works for us. I can't sit with him and help him until my day's calmed down a bit, you know. So I'm kind of grateful that we're not doing an synchronous learning with my child, because I don't know how I'd do it.
Yeah. Well, I guess what's really coming across there is that a big advantage of asynchronous learning is the flexibility it affords in a time where we're being forced to be flexible. You know, there isn't really even a choice element to it. Everybody has to accept that the situation is different. And what asynchronous learning brings is, I guess, a wider scope to adapt and be versatile with the situation. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And that's why it's sort of, reminding you of other models that we've talked about, such as personalised learning and things like blended learning, to its, furthest degree of actually the kids having such control over their sort of pace and place and time. And I think that model is what we're looking at here more so. And I get that it's going to vary with age group. Like you would hopefully be expecting a high school student to be much more responsible for their learning than, say, primary age group.
Yeah.
But I think that recognition that things are very different, and parents have been, massively thrown in the deep end, and kids are adapting. Their mental health is worrying at the moment as well. Everyone's adapting, so having a little bit less pressure, I think, to always be online for a certain time and being present for like synchronous learning all day, I think is kind of like a valuable approach at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly, I guess, hearing you talk about it there and that difference between older students, younger students, it's immediately obvious to see the benefits to a student in the situation that we're in now. All of the factors you've talked about to do with competing voices for the internet at home and all the rest. When we talk about from the teacher perspective for a moment though, just to almost play devil's advocate here, if you're a teacher who is only ever known, I guess, that more synchronous style of teaching within the classroom, and they're already learning to adapt to having to hold classrooms online and shift all of their learning there, that obviously is an overwhelming challenge. It's very difficult to deal with. And then bringing in asynchronous as this whole new method of delivery on top of that can definitely, I would say, seem quite overwhelming for a teacher. So within that context of asynchronous versus synchronous for a teacher in that situation, what would you say to a teacher who is in that position? To what extent can they marry both sides? What's an easy pathway for them to learn as they go, because it really is learning as you go, to adopt these asynchronous methods, which maybe they would not have ever used before?
Well, I think either way is quite scary if you've not used either before, because holding a synchronous lesson, where you've got, say, 30 kids on, zooming in or whatever, that's pretty frightening to work out, that technology. And, you've got, now you've got kids who can do multiple faces. I saw Snapchat had put like a face overlay that kids can use. Well, I've seen people in the office use them, but so various different.
Not just kids.
No, various different.
It would be so much
faces.
Easier if we were able to say kids in there.
No,
But no, it's all of us.
One of my colleagues spent a whole meeting just becoming different animals throughout the meeting,
which I'm sure was brilliant for productivity.
Oh, it was terrible. But say you've got 25 students all doing things like that. It's not like you've got any of the normal school comebacks of any punitive measures that you might take at school, because what are you going to do at the moment? It's, so I think the synchronous method is also pretty scary. And on top of that, you're trying to deliver a class whilst monitoring what can be internal chat, live chat, video faces, people talking, so I think in many ways, if you don't need to use a live webinar, and you can do, your lesson through a short video recording or a narrated PowerPoint or something like that can be accessed by students. Does it have to be synchronous, basically? I think in many ways that's actually less frightening. And then you might have things like drop-in sessions where it is a webinar, or you might have particular teams of kids that you taught together. So I know like Microsoft Teams has been quite popularly deployed across high schools and primary schools. And that often has a lower number in than Zoom. And the idea that I'd do there is I'd have like groups of kids, to take 24 kids, split them into groups of 6 and talk to 6 at a time, and maybe group them by ability or understanding or however you want to do it. But I think managing a smaller number is a lot less frightening than doing a webinar with 25, particularly if they have that ability to use some creative tools. It could be very challenging.
Because it's just, really, even just thinking about it, sort of almost bringing me out in a cold sweat, the idea of having to control a group of 25 little faces on a screen in front of you. You know, it must just be the most daunting thing. So yeah, I guess it's the perfect counterpoint to that. It's even if you're used to standing up at the front of a classroom, it actually is an entirely different kettle of fish.
Standing up in front of the classroom, you have got that. You've got your presence. You've got the consequences. You've got everything else normally at your disposal. And if you haven't got those things, and you coupled that with being quite unfamiliar with the technology, I think it's going to be a very difficult experience. There's a lady that I follow in the States called Caitlin Tucker, and she's like a blended learning guru. I've probably mentioned her before, but I just really love her work. And she put a post on the other day about 3 ways to use video conferencing. And her first kind of point was brilliant, which I thought was, really, first of all, question, does this have to be synchronous? What's my purpose of making this synchronous? And if it does, then she sort of created this table of, am I trying to hook a group into the learning? In which case, make your short webinar about being a hook. If you're trying to explain or model something, then it's kind of like the I do, we do, you do approach. And you can use sort of like, shared tools like a Google document, etc., to keep engagement going and things like that. Maybe it's assignment, like checking and reviewing for an assessment task. That's a really good thing for a synchronous session, because you do want all the kids to know. And I think generally kids would be better behaved if it's something to do with an assessment anyway. But maybe it's a present thing. So you might present for 3 to 5 minutes, pause and discuss, or, that sort of thing. But she really kind of identified, why are you doing a webinar? And if it can't really fit in one of those categories, then you're probably best making a video and being able to do that asynchronously. And I thought that was really good.
Yeah, definitely. It makes a lot of sense. And what I'm hearing even in that, and also in what you were saying before, was that it's less, I guess, would it be fair to say it's less an asynchronous versus synchronous thing and more about using the two in tandem in an intelligent way? Like there will, of course, have to be a time and a place, even in a circumstance like we're in now, where that synchronous element, the face-to-face element, it has to occur. But this idea of splitting into groups and using it in tandem with videos and all the rest kind of suggests that it's about picking and choosing how to match the two sides, asynchronous and synchronous, in the right way.
Yeah, I think so, for sure, because, it would be a lot to lose if you never did anything synchronously, because kids thrive off relationship, and so do teachers. Like I've seen so many of my teacher friends at the moment, they're just missing the kids. The schools are empty. They're missing one of pretty much the main purpose for them to be there, which is their love of their love of their kids, their love of the subject, and their love of learning. So I think you do, for everyone's mental well-being, you've got to sustain some part of that synchronous discussion and time together. But to have that as the only thing, I think, is actually probably super hard for not only the kids sort of, sat in front of the internet all day, maybe their family situation too, but also the teachers. Like if I was teaching at home now, like a lot of my friends are, and I've got Harry there, who's 6. I don't know how I'd be able to sustain both if I was doing a 6-hour synchronous day. Like a lot of the teachers have got their kids at home. Everyone's in a different situation. So I think having, predominantly asynchronous allows flexibility. It allows it to be more sustainable and, better paced for a self-paced model for learning. It sorts out those equity issues, for digital sort of skills and bandwidth and all of that sort of stuff. And I think it takes the pressure off the teachers in some ways to be able to also design their learning in the times that they're probably grabbing from their family and things like that to suit them too.
Yeah, of course. And you know, what comes through there as well is, of course, that this is not, I mean, this situation is so far from ideal, and nothing is going to be, as you say, that face-to-face in the room. Unfortunately, nothing can perfectly emulate that, but finding these solutions, marrying the different methods we have to find the best available solutions, the best that we can hope for, and predominantly asynchronous, but with synchronous at the right time sounds like the way to go. I'm just going to ask, we've already touched on a few that have come up here and there, but I'm going to ask if we can dive into just some real life examples of asynchronous learning, with the idea being a specific focus on, you know, practical methods that teachers can use in this current moment with the situation that they're in now, just to get a few kind of, maybe for teachers out there who themselves are still figuring out how to deal with all of this, just to give them a few kind of grade, maybe even easily mastered methods for how to bring asynchronous learning into their classrooms. As I say, you've already touched on a few already, but if we could just get a few examples of those kind of outlined so the teachers can sort of hear that and be like, oh, actually, I can bring that into my day-to-day teaching.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe we deal with those in sort of 3 different areas. So you've got your learning materials, you've got the support for learning, and then you've got kind of assessment and feedback. So if we kind of bucket around those ideas, I think with learning materials, you know, you've already, your kids will already have a range of things that you have provided for them in the past. So this may be as normal as, you know, a printed out work, like a booklet. It might be textbooks. It might be any sort of learning resource that you've already given them. If you're a school that has, say, Google Classrooms or an LMS, then you can present your learning materials through those as well. So kind of using, you know, PDFs embedded into any of those. If you really want to teach over a particular point of material, like I think every teacher can identify in their program what are the real teachable moments they need to have. And for those, I'd recommend something as simple as narrating over a PowerPoint. You know, you can export that as video, and then that becomes something that the kids can learn and work from. There's free tools out there like Screencast-O-Matic, where you can actually do a screen recording. You can have your face on that, or you can just have, just your voice. Anything like that where you are able to do that real teachable moment, you can record through Zoom. And then leverage anything that's already sort of open educational resources. So things like TED Talks, Khan Academy, stuff like that. There's like a lot of free things around. Like I know we've currently got an Access Our platform during the COVID emergency kind of thing as well. So there's quite a few companies that are really trying to help teachers out at this point in time. So have a look at things that you can actually use to deliver content. And then, just try and I would try and make some sort of structure in how you're going to deliver your learning materials so that you don't have to think about it every time. And it becomes kind of like consistent for you and for the kids so that they know what to expect. So that might be, if you're working in an LMS, that might be providing a page template. It might be that you always release the learning on a Monday and you're going to do a synchronous session Monday, what would normally be period 4, Wednesday period 3, publish it on a timetable so they know when you're available, that sort of thing. But I think sort of think of the first bucket, learning materials, and see what you've got at your fingertips already for that. And then learning support, I'd see this as where you're actually encouraging the students to do things. So you're supporting the learning. So this is like, you know, within Atomi, when we set lessons to kids, it becomes part of their to-do list. So that becomes very much like, you know, that's on their calendar that they have to do. And the same in an LMS, you know, if you're setting something with a deadline, you'll get a to-do list. And then I think there you can then have evidence of them completing tasks. If you've got things like forums and discussion posts and stuff, you'll see kids, you know, make sure that the kids have contributed. So maybe make things, the discussions like have 1 mark to them as complete and not complete. And then, have some time when you communicate and you can actually keep them up to date on their learning, you know. And there's a few things around communication in this kind of learning support piece that are worth kind of mentioning. Most schools, I think, would have come up with some sort of policy now for how teachers and kids are going to communicate. You know, particularly now that it's sort of video communication. I've seen quite a few things over LinkedIn where teachers, like where the school leaders have set expectations that, you know, kids cannot talk to their classmates and to their teacher, you know, from their bedrooms, if at all possible, obviously, you know, that just, but very much sort of encouraging any parents listening to think through anything like that, you know.
Just very quickly on that, what the logic behind that? What would you say that is? It's this.
I think it's very much that's a personal space, and you know, very much like we want to steer away from anything like that in terms of the world of the internet can be, you know, quite awful in some ways, and we often protect our kids quite strongly from that within the school environment. You know, like we've got, and any school will have an absolute plethora of firewalls and everything like that to protect the kids when they're in schools. And obviously that's not the same at home, and some parents will or won't have their own kind of security settings, etc. So you're now in a sort of brave new world of, you know, communication happening in the home, in video learning. And I think just the first few weeks that schools were using Zoom, there were so many instances of people, if the meetings were open meetings, of Zoom bombers became like a new phrase in our language.
Something I never heard of, but I've definitely heard that phrase popping up here and there. And
awful behaviour happening, you know. And so obviously then it got very much, there was different security settings changed and that sort of thing. But this whole idea about some digital etiquette, I think is just protecting both the teachers and the students, you know. So it's worthwhile checking out your school's policy on this. And like just personally, for example, I'd be much more comfortable talking to kids in groups, you know, like having, like, you know, out of your class you've got a small group, maybe a tutorial sort of groups of 4 that you check in with, you know, so if 2 don't arrive, you've still got 2 to talk to, that kind of thing. But I don't think you can record every conversation that you have, but, you know, normally in a school when you're having one-on-one conversations with a kid, there are people around, you know, and if you're at all worried about any you know, possibilities of allegations against you, anything like that, then you have a colleague with you, or you have a chat in the open. And so I think having chats just over a video where things might be able to be misconstrued, or, you know, I think teachers have to protect themselves, and, you know, kids have to also be aware of this difference. And I think that nice expectation of not having conversations in bedrooms or sat on a bed, you know, for example, it might be that their desk's in their bedroom, and that's not so bad, but sort of curled up in bed having a conversation, I think he's not a goer.
I mean, it actually really does, as you explain it, make a lot of sense. And this idea of digital etiquette, it's a strange concept because it's so new, and it's something that so many of us would sort of, even when I hearing it, I'm like, oh, this is such a thing that would never have even crossed my mind. But it does. It absolutely makes sense. It's makeshift, like everything at the moment, but it does maintain that, I guess, the professionalism of it, for want of a better word, keeping that in place, which is of course important because it is still the teacher to students.
It's still a formal relationship. And I think, you know, for any parents listening, the more that you can have the kids sat at the kitchen table for anything that is a synchronous session, you know, by all means, when it's asynchronous, let them be wherever they want, you know. But I think for synchronous sessions, it's worthwhile kind of being a presence in that and making a thing of it, you know. Absolutely. So I think that kind of under that basket of learning support, you know, sort of checking in, particularly if you are doing an asynchronous model, you'll have to work out when your check-ins are, and what tool it is that you're going to do those check-ins with. You know, like if you're using our platform, you'll see things like quiz completion and that sort of stuff. And if you notice that a kid's not completed the last 2 quizzes, then that's probably time to phone the parents and have a conversation around that. Like, I wouldn't let things linger as such, you know. And then I think the other piece that is, I liked your phrase earlier of, you know, makeshift. We are all kind of thinking in a makeshift way. But I think the other thing to think about is assessment and feedback. And the way that we would typically do assessments is changed, like is basically changed overnight, you know. So I think thinking back to when I was director of curriculum, the last week of term 1 would have been like assessment week for year 11 and 12. So the last 2 weeks probably. So these 2 weeks that we've just finished. And so a lot of that would have been timed responses in classes, you know, like not formal examinations, because you're not in New South Wales, you're not allowed to do too many of those, but sort of like a timed response in a class. And obviously we can't do that now, you know. So how do you protect against you know, plagiarism? How do you make sure it is the kids' work, etc.? So I think teachers are having to think very much on their feet as we look at this for term 2. You know, what are my assessments coming up and how can I re-envisage them for the online space? And so I think some ways there is to, you know, lean on the tools that you've got. It might be that you do need a synchronous session where you can see that the kids are doing their, you know, assessment, like set them the question and you've got this hour to complete it and you kind of watch them type, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, or a quiz that you've built in one of your platforms and you release it and they have 30 minutes to complete it and then it's done, you know. So I think you're going to have to think very differently about what the assessments look like for this term. You know, you might turn
continuous assessment probably is another thing that becomes even more important than it already was.
Yeah, well, that's where you're doing that support of learning to make sure that they are engaging with the content, they are you know, sort of learning the steps they need to along the way, the content they need to along the way. And it's difficult because, you know, obviously assessment schedules are already published and it takes a lot to redo those when you're in that position in a school. But, you know, there's going to need to be some changes made because they just can't be the same as what they were before this happened, you know.
Of course. Plenty of changes that need to be made, but plenty of good suggestions on how they can be made. So, you know, very, I'm sure there are plenty of people thankful to hear those and can hopefully bring them into their own classroom. The last thing I was going to ask you about was resources, but I feel like you've already touched on them with the idea of learning materials and some great suggestions there. So I might fast forward straight to Sue's hot tip, which generally speaking, I know as regular listeners will know, is just a general piece of advice from the world of education. But for this one, given the nature of the episode, I might ask Sue if your hot tip for the day could be perhaps a little more skewed towards the current situation and maybe just a little bit of advice for teachers who are now being forced, obviously, to adapt and come up with these makeshift solutions and all the stresses and pressures and difficulties that brings. What little bit of it doesn't even have to be serious, doesn't even necessarily have to have too much to do with teaching, but any little bit of advice you might have for teachers in this current moment.
Oh, there's so many. I feel like I want 4.
Well, pick the best. Choose the best.
Really? I think be kind on yourself and on your learners. You know, there's so much to adapt to right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, you know, so if you're not working at your best and you feel stressed, and your kids feel stressed, and it's not the way you envisage the year, just be kind to yourself and don't make life overcomplicated. You know, keep it simple. Look at your program and think, what's the absolute, what's the core of the things that need to be covered here, you know, and take away some of those icing on the cake activities, and just sort of strip back what you need to do to its bare bones. This will pass, and, you know, you can fill in some gaps if they occur, but I think just be kind to yourself. It's a phenomenal job that you've been thrown in to do, to adapt to synchronous or asynchronous learning overnight, you know, for like literally in a week for some schools and stuff. So I think just, breathe and be kind to yourself.
It's excellent advice. It might sound simple, but especially in a time like this where, you know, our face-to-face contact is limited, and, you know, people can bring up all sorts of difficulties. It really is sound and sage advice. So thank you for that.
You're
Sue.
doing a fantastic job, teachers. Just hear that loud and clear. Like, I think so many people around the country, around every country, I think is just so... They've had a window into a life of a teacher that they've never had before. And I think, you know, our importance is more than ever has been, you know, risen to the forefront.
Exactly. We can't congratulate you face to face, unfortunately, but we are congratulating you virtually.
Yes.
Alrighty. Well, that is all that we have time for on today's episode. Everybody out there, look after yourselves. Make sure you're washing your hands, maintaining your social distance, following the advice that has been given, and being kind to yourself and others, most importantly. In the meantime, you can check out any other episodes we have up on whatever platform you are listening to this on, or check us out at our main site at getatomy.com. Until next time, it is goodbye from Sue.
Bye, everyone.
And goodbye from me. See ya.